Hello, today I'll be covering another of the story arcs of the manga Battle Angel Alita. This video will be going over the Hunter Warrior arc, the second story arc of the series consisting of chapters 8 through 12. As you will know if you've seen my previous video, the first arcs of this series introduced us to Alita, a cyborg martial artist with amnesia that finds herself in the Scrapyard, a dystopian city of trash living in the shadow of Zalem, a mysterious floating city above. Living with Dr. Ito, Alita chose to become a hunter warrior, which is basically a bounty hunter, and the closest thing to law enforcement this place has. She faced and defeated Makaku, the most feared cyborg killer around, but now we'll see her life take a bit of a different tack. Without further preamble, let's jump right into this brutal sci-fi martial arts manga with a meet-cute situation. As we start, Alita is waking up in a daze, not quite sure how she got there, though she doesn't seem too bothered by it. She seems to be in some sort of dilapidated industrial space with a hole in the roof. Suddenly, a boy appears and asks her what she's doing. Alita doesn't know, which he finds funny. She asks for help getting up, and he agrees, revealing a scar on his wrist. Alita's cyborg body is heavier than she looks, though, and ends up pulling the boy to the ground. She seems mortified and self-consciously hides her metal hands when the boy notices. This confuses Alita, who isn't sure why she's acting so bashful. The boy seems to realize she's uncomfortable and throws himself down on the ground, looking up at the sky like she was a moment ago, remarking how nice it is. He asks her if she wants to check out the view from the roof. From there, the boy points out Zalem in the sky above. He's been playing around this old factory since he was a kid, and he liked to look up at the city. He says it takes his breath away every time, like it's sucking his soul upward. That sounds kind of sinister when you put it like that, if you ask me. Alita doesn't think so, though. Actually, she isn't looking at Zalem at all. She seems charmed by this boy's smile and dreamy expression, saying it's funnier to look at his face. As you might realize at this point, this arc is showing us a very different side to Alita's development. While the first arc focused mostly on Alita as a warrior and her desire to protect, in this first scene, Alita is just a girl that met a boy she finds cute. We're seeing a softer and very human side to her. Not that we've left the violence behind entirely. When the boy cautions Alita to be wary of a hole in the roof, she remembers that she actually fell through that hole earlier. The whole reason Alita came to this factory was to hunt a bounty. As a hunter-warrior, she had tracked down a figure called Megal the Chemist and his thugs. He was wanted for all the brain deaths his homemade drugs were causing. None of them posed much of a threat until Megal inserted his own concoction into his temple via some sort of implant, much to the shock of his goons. Megal begins to hulk out and mutate, taking on a canine appearance. Apparently, Megal developed a werewolf pill, as one of his thugs exclaims before his brain gets scooped out. Wait until you hear how this thing is supposed to work. It reduces conscious thought and elevates bestial attack instinct. Thus, the user is forced to believe they are a beast to such a degree that it actually alters their body and increases their strength. So we have a pill that turns someone into a werewolf by some sort of chemically induced hypnosis and the power of belief. That's kind of an out there concept even for a manga like this to spring on you out of nowhere, but it never comes up again, so maybe the author realized this was a bit of a weird idea. Not to drag on the tangent any longer, the werewolf quickly tears apart his own men and leaps to the rooftops to escape. Alita gives chase. When the werewolf lunges at her, she's able to damage his arm and then savagely kick him away. Unfortunately, the roof partially gave way and Alita lost her footing, tumbling through a hole and hitting her head on an I-beam on the way down. That's how she ended up in a daze on the ground with short-term memory loss. Alita doesn't have much time to contemplate this before the boy stumbles upon the remains of her battle with Megal's thugs. He's shocked by the carnage and says it looks like a dinosaur rampage through here, something Alita feels a little embarrassed by. She plays dumb and pretends not to know anything. After getting over his surprise, the boy has Alita hand him a toolbox and starts prying at the cyborg's backplate. He's after the backbone. Apparently the spinal column or backbone is one of the only body parts you can't get an artificial replacement for in the scrapyard, at least not cheaply, so the real thing has high value on the market. Alita is offended and calls him a thief, but the boy just says scavenging parts from what is basically a dead body isn't a crime, and he won't get hung up on the little stuff in the quest for survival. Their little tiff is interrupted by the return of the werewolf, busting through a wall and looking very worse for wear. Alita is very ready to put him down, but the boy puts himself in front of her and starts pulling Alita to safety. Being very taken with this act of chivalry, Alita decides to play damsel. She surreptitiously lashes out behind her with 2 kicks, the second of which hits the werewolf so hard one of his eyeballs is knocked out. The monster is stunned, or possibly dead, standing up since something is foaming out of his ears. The boy doesn't realize this and whacks it over the head with a pipe, at which point it collapses. He is surprised, and Alita makes impressed noises, letting him think he saved them. He finally introduces himself as Yugo, and they banter a bit about Alita's name sounding tougher than she looks. I wonder if that worked better in the original Japanese, where she's called Gally. They part ways with Alita almost giddy, giggling to herself about the possibility of seeing him again. I think Alita has her first crush. Not everything is as it seems, however. Sometime later in the scrapyard, a pair of panhandlers accost a cyborg, offering oiling services and a free waxing. After ushering him off the street and beginning to administer the oil, the beggar electrocutes him, calling for his accomplice Tanji to keep a lookout. They won't kill the guy, but they will take his backbone, which apparently is a non-lethal procedure for cyborgs. The perpetrator gives Dr. Ito an anonymous call, summoning help for his victim, then is revealed to be Yugo. Clearly, this guy is much shadier than Alita thinks. She and Ito are clearly in the dark about Yugo's activities, as it turns out that Yugo regularly visits Ito's clinic to tune up their windmill once a month. Alita just never saw who did it before now, I guess. Yugo does this for 30 other places and lots of odd jobs besides, it seems. All of this is in service of fulfilling his dream, buying a ticket to visit Zalem. Alita is drawn to Yugo's passion for his dream. She doesn't really have something like that herself. Dr. Ito and his friend Gonzu know what's up, correctly noticing there's a bit of romance in the air. Ito notes that he feels a bit like a worried father, prompting Gonzu to reassure him that Yugo is an honest, hard-working kid, so he has nothing to worry about. If only he knew. Coincidentally, Ito is also in the middle of treating Yugo's victim from last night, who's impatient that Ito hasn't found a replacement spinal column yet. Yugo rushes by as he leaves, and his victim definitely thinks his voice sounds like the one that attacked him. He doesn't voice his suspicions, though. Alita gets depressed when Yugo leaves and starts asking things like, "Do you think Yugo would ever like a cyborg girl like me?" Gonzu and Ito, of course, immediately leap in to reassure her and cheer her up. As Yugo leaves Ito's clinic, he runs into none other than Zapan. Yeah, you might remember him. He was one of the hunter warriors that Alita mocked when she was looking for help fighting Makaku. He was also one of the lucky few that got away with his life when Makaku crashed that party. Zapan warns Yugo to stay away from Alita and gives him a very creative interpretation of Alita's conflict with Makaku. He says an ugly guy proposed to Alita and wound up torn to pieces and burned to nothing for his trouble. Yugo is confused and baffled by this unsolicited advice, so he just leaves. It's clear that Zapan is holding a bit of a grudge. He worked hard to make his name as a hunter warrior, and now, thanks to her, he's been totally humiliated. Zapan has made it his mission to reduce Alita to tears. Later that night, Alita and Ito are out working together as hunter warriors. Alita really isn't feeling it though, and is so distracted one of the targets is able to stab her. She's so startled that she accidentally rips the guy's arms off. I mean, the blade couldn't even pierce her berserker body, but still. Now Alita is just disturbed that she was able to maim this person without even meaning to, reflecting on the fragility of human bodies. Ito questions her, but she just makes an excuse about admiring the moon and leaps away, parkouring her way to the rooftops, and reflects that her body was able to shoot plasma and destroy things, but it wasn't made for loving other people. As she overlooks the scrapyard in one of my favorite images from the early manga, Alita says that this city is hideous. In a way, it's just like me, an artificial creation, where people live in the cracks between the junk and the machines. But there's no going back to the way it was. It's only thanks to these machines that I'm alive now. I have to live with the machines, she thinks to herself. Yugo, I wish I could touch you. I wish I could hold you. Thinking of the man she just tore apart, Alita sheds tears in mourning for the things she doesn't believe she can have. This is a very moody, introspective moment. It's arguably coming up a bit abruptly, but it is a significant break from what the manga was doing in the last arc. Previously, Alita's power was a big focus in terms of how it allowed her to stand up to monsters that nobody else could, and confront the challenges of this world on her own terms. Now that strength has become a barrier for her, a source of apprehension. I kind of admire the author's willingness to flip things around like that. The very thing that makes her so powerful might cause her to hurt someone she cares about. It's a pretty horrible realization to come to when you think about it. It makes this feel very different from many similar fighting genre stories. Down in the scrapyard below, however, Yugo is out and about, reminding us that he probably isn't worth all this anguish for Alita. He's working the same scam again, luring in his prey, paralyzing them, then removing their backbone. This time, he's interrupted. A figure looms over him in the alley. He knows Yugo, remarking that he's really made a name for himself. We'll have to wait to find out how that conversation went, though. Sometime the following morning, Alita has ventured to a part of the scrapyard near that great mountain of garbage at the center. This is where Yugo lives, and Alita has come to see him. He isn't around, so Alita hangs out with some friendly homeless old men. They offer her a rat on a stick. She declines. The old men tell her that Yugo's been out all night, probably earning chips so he can buy his way to Zalem. The old men think this is folly. Those born on the earth live their whole lives there as an ironclad rule. Yugo doesn't listen to them, though, and to make matters worse, he's apparently been making waves with some shady dealers, doing dangerous dirty work for big money. They seem to like Yugo and tell Alita to grab his heart and don't let it go, to bring him back to Earth and wake up from his crazy dream. Alita isn't so sure. She also didn't come alone. Zapan is spying on her, presumably looking for opportunities to get revenge. He's the first to see Yugo return. He also isn't alone. That figure Yugo met before turns out to be an underworld boss named Vector. He ominously says he looks forward to Yugo's answer, before Yugo empties his stomach on the ground. Apparently, he is very drunk. Alita is not amused by this and immediately blames Vector. She calls him out and threatens to come after him if he drags Yugo into his twisted world of crooks. Vector is not impressed. Alita helps Yugo inside and gets him some water, asking him about what happened. Yugo clarifies that Vector is actually on his side, asking Alita what the heck she's doing here. Well, Alita has apparently decided that the safest way to express her feelings to Yugo is to do housework for him. He is understandably confused, but grateful. He has a lot on his mind as he reflects on his encounter with Vector, leading us into a flashback. As soon as Vector appeared in that alleyway, he picked up Yugo's axe and embedded it deep into the skull of his paralyzed victim, killing him. Yugo is disturbed, but Vector coolly explains that since he heard Vector say Yugo's name, he couldn't be let go. Vector warns Yugo that if he doesn't do this job right, he'll end up dead. He isn't here to lecture Yugo about this, though. He has something to discuss. Vector invites Yugo into his up-armored car. Vector reminds Yugo of an agreement they made 3 years ago, that for 10 million chips, he'll send Yugo to Zalem. It should have taken him 10 years to scrape together that kind of money, but Yugo has only been at it for 3 and he'll have the total in another 6 months. Vector is impressed and says he values having Yugo around. They pull up at a factory, which, if you'll remember, is basically the closest thing to a government office the Scrapyard has. The factory manages all the industries of the Scrapyard, which ultimately supply Zalem and serve its interests. Yugo is surprised since they don't usually let people just stroll up into the inner workings, but Vector is a special case. He leads Yugo right into a big cargo area filled with goods to be sent up the transport tubes to Zalem. Vector comes up with some liquor and offers Yugo a glass, assuring him that it's the real deal rather than the synthetic swill you'll find in the Scrapyard. He explains a bit about the logistical reality of the Scrapyard and Zalem, how almost everything produced in the Scrapyard and the outlying farms is sent up to Zalem. What remains below is just scraps and leftovers. The management of this process was always left up to the deckmen, cyborg servitors created by the factory. But that is changing now. Zalem is going to have local human beings manage the system now, and Vector has his foot in the door. He already has 6 different relay routes planned, and he wants Yugo to manage one of those routes. Vector points out that if Yugo spends everything he has to get that ticket to Zalem, he'll just be a penniless beggar up there. On the other hand, the opportunity to skim off the top of Zalem's shipments down here is incredibly lucrative. A few goods smuggled from the top-shelf shipments would make a killing on the black market. Yugo could live as well as any Zalemite without ever leaving the Scrapyard. Yugo is conflicted, though, and he didn't give Vector an answer right away. In the present, he calls out to Alita, who appears to be in the midst of destroying some of his clothes with overly enthusiastic washing. He asks her if she has any dreams. She doesn't respond. Yugo goes on, explaining that he doesn't want to go to Zalem to live in luxury. He wants to get as high and as far as one can go, to see the world from a different vantage point. Alita sits by him after a moment, and asks how much money he needs to go to Zalem. She's been told at this point that going to Zalem isn't a good thing for Yugo to pursue, but she doesn't have it in her to oppose him. She loves the way he looks at the sky and won't oppose his dream. She just wants to be close to him for now. Safe to say, she's smitten. It seems to me she's drawn to Yugo because he has this big dream of moving beyond life in the Scrapyard, while Alita herself is mostly content as she is. Alita probably also recognizes that Yugo wouldn't have his lively spark if he didn't have that dream. Alita has some newfound resolve, and she's taking that resolve into her hunter-warrior work. Look, it's the same guy from earlier who somehow did not go into shock and die after Alita tore his arms off. He got some replacements. Though it doesn't do him much good as Alita takes his head without much effort. She's downright jaunty about it, in fact, which Ito notes is unusual for her. Alita lets him know that she's decided to join Yugo on his trip to Zalem. Apparently being a hunter-warrior pays a lot better than everything Yugo's doing. She'll have 10 million in a month. Ito is shocked by her answer. Meanwhile, Yugo's back to his old tricks, and sad to say, it's all downhill from here for Yugo. He courts yet another victim and lures him into a secluded place, but this time he's in for an unpleasant surprise. "So this is how you've been doing it. Zapan says as Yugo goes to paralyze him. The boy doesn't have much of a chance. Zapan may not be much compared to Alita, but he is a hunter-warrior after all, and easily capable of stopping a street urchin like Yugo. He taunts the boy, asking if he thinks Alita will be upset if she sees his face on a bounty poster. While cornering Yugo against the wall, Zapan explains that stealing the central nervous systems from the living is more than worth a bounty under factory law. He tries to get the boy to take off his mask, digging his cyborg thumb into Yugo's shoulder, but he's completely forgotten about Yugo's friends. I mean, it doesn't do them much good, mind you. Their attempt to rescue Yugo ends with one tossed up to the roof and then beheaded, while the other is cut in half by Zapan's thrown blade. Their deaths do give Yugo an opening, though. He throws an improvised incendiary explosive of some kind right into Zapan's stupid face. Yugo is able to make his escape, but the hunter-warrior was only singed. Zapan is angry, but not very upset. After all, he thinks to himself, revenge is best served cold, and what better way for Romeo to meet his end than at the hands of his sweet Juliet? Ultimately, Yugo is able to make his way to a payphone and call Vector. Nearly hysterical, he explains what happened and Vector offers him safe haven, telling him to bring all the chips he's gathered so far. If that sounds suspicious, well, you have better instincts than Yugo, apparently. By the way, he mentions his two accomplices were named Van and Tanji, if you were curious. Yugo knows the situation is bad, and he's going to be a wanted man now, but he's determined not to die, not until he's made it to Zalem. For some reason, though, thoughts of Alita flit through his mind, which confuses him. I'm going to break for a moment here to explain this whole bounty business. I mentioned this in my last video, but the author includes these informational sections sometimes that explain more about the world than is explicitly said in the text. In this case, it's a bit of extra information about how crime works in the Scrapyard. The law of the land here is factory law, which mostly exists to ensure the industries of the Scrapyard run smoothly, not protect the people's rights or safety. Factory law generally puts crimes in two categories, Class A and Class B. You'll notice that brain murder and brain assault are Class B crimes. Since full-body cyborg conversions are possible in this world, people are only seen as truly dead if their brain is destroyed. However, killing people is completely legal in the context of competitive death sport events, like that gladiatorial arena briefly featured in the last arc. Stealing body parts from the living is also a Class B crime, so that's what Yugo is guilty of. You'll notice that Class A crimes mostly consist of things like theft or destruction of factory property, or hacking into the factory, or possessing a means of flight, or possessing firearms. In short, things that might pose a threat to the factory or Zalem, just so you understand the priorities here. The classes of crime determine the extent of the factory's response, but ultimately the punishment for all these crimes is the same. The factory puts a price on your head, and the first licensed hunter-warrior to turn in your severed head gets the payout. The author notes that despite their brutality and individual skills, the disorganization of the hunter-warriors means only a small percentage of criminals in the Scrapyard are actually ever caught. To get back to the story, Alita and Ito are experiencing some of those lucrative payouts right now. Alita made over 500,000 chips in what was apparently only one night of work. Having no idea that Yugo's life is currently imploding, Alita is downright giddy at the prospect of going to Zalem with him. Ito feels confused, internally suggesting that the idea you can pay your way to Zalem is ridiculous. He calls out to her after they've turned in their bounties, asking her if she's told Yugo how she felt, and asked him how he felt. She has not, and Ito reproaches her for building such life-changing plans on such an insubstantial relationship. Yeah, I'm with Ito on this. I actually think this is pretty important to evaluating this arc as a whole, and sometimes it gets missed in some fan discussions. It isn't actually much of a love story, though that's sometimes how it gets described. Alita is infatuated, clearly, but a relationship requires two people. Yugo might feel something for Alita, but he doesn't seem properly aware of those feelings himself. So it's very one-sided, and Alita hasn't been the best about communicating her feelings. Ultimately, a lot of this arc just reinforces how emotionally immature Alita actually is, which makes sense seeing as she has amnesia. She only has maybe a few months or even weeks of memory at this point, at most. She's a powerful cyborg warrior, but Alita has the same sort of insecurities and fears as any young person coming to terms with themselves and their world. As she admits to Ito, the reason she hasn't raised her feelings with Yugo is because she's scared. Ito gives her some very good advice, saying that it's normal to turn a blind eye to reality when we don't want to face it, but you can't ignore it forever. At some point, you have to stare it down and decide where you stand. Alita does the "you don't understand what it's like to be me" thing, which Ito admits is true, but he can tell she's avoiding her problems. This isn't like the bold, brave Alita he knows. Alita clarifies that she isn't running. She's holding herself back because she thinks that expressing her true feelings may result in her tearing Yugo's delicate human body to pieces. She can't solve this problem with her strength because her strength is the problem. Alita accidentally crumbles a metal pipe like it's paper while saying this, demonstrating the point. Ito isn't really sure what to say to that. "Good evening. Well, fancy meeting you here." As they lapse into silence, Zapan appears, carrying the severed heads of Yugo's friends. Not that Alita would know that, she's never met them. Zapan smirks at her, saying he has news. Alita doesn't remember him. When they last met, he was really just one of a dozen or so hunter-warriors she made a fool of, even if he was the spokesman of the group. After he's recovered from that blow to the ego, or seethes his way through it, Zapan reveals Yugo's complicity in the recent spinal thefts. He announces that he's about to turn this information into the bounty lists, and claims that Alita, as a hunter-warrior, can't turn a blind eye. Curiously, that's almost exactly the phrase Ito just used. Alita is stunned by this turn of events, but she has to confront reality and make a choice. There's a bit of a time jump between chapters here, with Yugo's bounty information being distributed by the system and displayed on screens throughout the Scrapyard. 80,000 chips for his head. It's also started to rain. Alita speeds by in a state of distress, desperate to find Yugo. She loses her footing in her distraction and, well, it's a pretty spectacular wipeout. Alita was going so fast that she skids and skips along the ground, smashes into a car which smashes through a fence, and she goes tumbling through the air. Alita is going through what is essentially a high-speed car accident right now, but she's so unfazed by it that it doesn't even interrupt her internal monologue. Alita knows she can't hunt and kill Yugo as Zapan said she should. Protecting Yugo, however, would mean fighting other hunter-warriors and having a bounty on her own head. Hunter-warrior treason is a Class A crime. Ito will be furious with her. She bounces off a pile of wrecked cars and falls down until she is deposited in a deep puddle. By the time Alita starts to get up, however, she has found her resolve. She's willing to suffer the consequences. She's going to protect Yugo. That was probably a foregone conclusion, but I like that she thought about it. There was a similar moment in the previous arc where Alita hesitated before going to rescue a baby, knowing it was an obvious trap. She's heroic, but thoughtful, and acts with a full understanding of the danger. When Alita ultimately gets to Yugo's home, she finds it partially demolished and plastered in wanted posters. A factory servitor called a netman is there, printing out the posters and asking the locals to report any information to the factory. Now, there is an information page elaborating on the netmen in the back of the volume, and this seems like as good a time as any to explain. The Netmen are a form of cyborg, much like the Deckmen that were created to serve the factory, in this case, in a law enforcement role. Netmen are stationed on street corners to collect crime reports. They interview witnesses and gather DNA evidence. If a criminal is identified, they are added to the bounty lists. Netmen don't take a direct role in going after criminals except in the case of Class A criminals, in which case they can arm up and take charge of the hunter-warriors. Back to the story, this Netman is reiterating that factory law merely exists as a debugging procedure to ensure the smooth functioning of the scrapyard for the benefit of Zalem. The needs of scrapyard residents are not part of the equation. As Alita looks at Yugo's destroyed house, she has an idea where he might be. Meanwhile, Ito and Zapan are still standing out in front of the factory. Zapan jokes about making a bet on whether Alita will go on the run with Yugo. Ito is disgusted and tries to leave. Zapan's role in this isn't done, however, and he still has plans to torment Alita. Ito has a part in those plans. The doctor attempts to resist, but Zapan dodges his attack and knocks him out. Far away, we return to the dilapidated factory where this story began, the place Yugo has known since childhood, where he would go to look up at Zalem. This is where he has gone to ground in his darkest hours. It's also apparently where he's been hiding all the chips he's been amassing, just 500,000 short of his 10 million goal. Suddenly, a door creaks open and Yugo arms himself with more firebombs. To his shock, it's Alita, looking like a drowned cat. She's pleased to see him, having correctly guessed that this is where he would go. Alita shows Yugo his bounty poster, which he makes a joke out of, laughing that he's a cheap target. Without an ounce of shame, Yugo admits to the body part snatching, only apologizing for hiding it from her. He did everything to raise funds to go to Zalem. Alita assumes that Yugo will be going on the run now, getting as far from the scrapyard as possible, but he says otherwise. Yugo isn't going anywhere. He's going to head back into town and see what happens. He's going back to Vector, and he hasn't given up on Zalem yet. He explains that this really isn't about Zalem in particular. He just wants to go as far as he can. This is a contest of wills between himself and the scrapyard. The people here have always been trying to rip away his dreams and his pride. He refuses to let himself be ground down and become human scrap like them. Just having a dream, even if it's a stupid one, is proof he's his own man. If he gives up on it, everything he's done and stood for would have been a lie. Now I find this interesting because this attitude reminds me a bit of Alita herself. A big part of the contrast between Alita and Makaku in the last arc was Alita's conviction that she could live her own way despite the world, while Makaku believed everyone was predestined by circumstance. Yugo is determined to live his own way and never back down to what the world throws at him. Maybe that's why Alita feels drawn to him at the end of the day. Anyway, Yugo tells Alita to go home so that she doesn't get dragged into this, but Alita sees this as her last chance to share her feelings with him. So she just comes out and says it. Yugo, I really like you. How do you feel about me? And she immediately sinks into a pit of furious anxiety. Relatable. What if he doesn't answer the way she wants? Would she still go against the factory and become a bounty for his sake? Even if she fights for his sake, she might still end up killing him by accident with her strength. Yugo is surprised and tries to laugh it off, telling her to go home. Alita is pretty high-strung at the moment, though, and demands an answer, slamming her hand into the wall behind him so hard it cracks. She also notes to herself that if she does accidentally kill Yugo, she'll just kill herself. Oh, that's a healthy way to think. As for Yugo, who has not meaningfully confronted his own feelings before now, he realizes that he was so busy looking up at Zalem that he never noticed how beautiful Alita's eyes were. He touches her hair and says, I guess we're accomplices now. Alita smiles and kisses him. A bit later, Yugo is ruining the moment by telling Alita that kissing her reminded him of licking a battery. Come on, man. Well, it doesn't seem to bother her too much. Apparently, her cyborg body recharges on stormy days like this, so it makes sense. Alita takes the moment to ask Yugo about the scar on his wrist, which he describes as a memento of his brother. It's time for Yugo's backstory. You see, Yugo was raised by his much older brother and his wife. His brother was a bold and curious man. The people of the Scrapyard don't know the origin of their world, such as why Zalem was built, but he wondered. He even figured out how Zalem stays in the sky. It isn't floating, it's hanging. The great shaft rising up from Zalem likely reaches all the way into space, with a second city at the other end in orbit. Gravity and centrifugal force balance each other out so that both can stay in place. One night, Yugo's brother leapt out of bed in excitement. He had an idea. To see Zalem and the shaft it hung from up close to solve the mysteries of this world, he would fly. He planned to construct a hot air balloon that could take him. Now you might remember from my earlier spiel about what constitutes crime in the Scrapyard that possessing means of flight is a Class A crime, but he isn't worried because hunter warriors can't fly. Okay, maybe he isn't that smart. So Yugo's brother started building his balloon in the very factory place Alita and Yugo are in now. His brother and his brother's wife started having arguments. She was afraid of all he was risking and everything they would have to leave behind by heading up in his balloon. The balloon was finished when Yugo was 10 years old. On the day the weather was right and his brother planned to take his flight, his brother's wife sent Yugo into town on an errand. He noticed something off about her behavior that whole day, but he went off as she asked. When he returned, it was already getting dark and there was a column of smoke rising from his brother's workshop. The balloon was in flames, and a hunter warrior was holding his brother's severed head. His brother's wife grabbed Yugo and told him not to watch, begging the hunter warrior to just take the head and leave. That's when Yugo realized that she had reported his brother and betrayed them. She would try to raise Yugo on her own, but not long after Yugo ran away and started living on the street. One day, after 2 years of living on his own, Yugo was passing a body part vendor and recognized his brother's hand. Seeing that hand brought it all back, the memories and dreams he had forgotten. Yugo demanded a trade, his hand for his brother's. The vendor didn't go for it, but Vector stepped out of a car behind him and told him to do it. He liked the cut of Yugo's jib and told his own doctor to perform the transplant. Yugo elected to keep the surgical scar as a reminder of his brother's dream. The doctor, entirely unprompted, told Yugo that he should talk to Vector if he wants to go to Zalem. He has influence with the factory, and he's the only person in the Scrapyard that's ever been to Zalem. Yugo believed this without question and demanded Vector send him there. Vector said, "Sure, for 10 million chips." That's how Yugo met Vector, and this whole mess got started. Yugo's been raising money for 3 years since then, and he's got 9.5 million hidden here in his hideaway. The first thing Alita asks about is what happened to the brother's wife. Yugo doesn't know. Alita feels that she understands how the wife must have felt, that she must have felt bothered by her husband's attention on something so far away, and not on her. She must have felt jealous, so she killed him. Yugo laughs it off, saying she'd have to kill him to stop him from going to Zalem. Alita says that's not the worst idea, and maybe she should kill him. She says this while walking up to Yugo and leaning in with a somewhat creepily cheerful smile on her face. Suffice to say, it's a not-so-subtle warning to Yugo about where his priorities should be. But then she puts all 650,000 chips she's raised from bounties into his hand, putting him over the 10 million total. Now he can go to Zalem right away. Alita even says she'll make sure he gets to Vector safely, then follow after him once she's raised enough money through bounties. Yugo doesn't know how to handle this. He thanks her and excuses himself to answer a call of nature. Outside, the rain has eased up as Yugo washes his face in a water-filled barrel. He feels he should do something for Alita and questions whether he should really rush off to Zalem on his own. He doesn't have long to wonder, though. They've been found. It's the same hunter-warrior that killed his brother years ago, which is probably how he knew to look for Yugo at this old factory, and he wastes no time cutting right into Yugo with his burning hand. Yugo's right arm, the one with his brother's hand attached, is sheared right off and falls to the ground. The second hit takes a chunk out of his torso. Alita notices the disturbance just as the hunter-warrior is holding Yugo by the hair, with his white-hot palm held to deliver the coup de grace. He says, "Return to substance." That's a weird thing to say. This character is named Clive Lee, by the way. His name is only revealed offhandedly much later in the manga. What he says here is a reference to substantist thought, which is an offshoot of Cartesian dualism, according to the note at the bottom of the page. The phrase he's using is apparently an altered Buddhist saying. It means to pass beyond the troubles of the world and return to matter. So basically this is like telling someone to rest in peace before shooting them in the face. Alita bursts through the side of the building 2 stories up, determined to protect Yugo. She kicks Clive Lee as she falls and drives him back. The hunter-warrior recognizes Alita and interprets her interference as an attempt to steal his bounty. He wants her to clear off, warning her that doing so is a grievous crime. Alita only cares about Yugo, who is not looking good. I see an exposed rib cage and his intestines are falling out. When Alita turns to the hunter, she meets his white-hot palm with her own, using the magnetic power of her berserker body to manipulate the plasma of the flames. If that sounded like gibberish to you, it's a whole thing from the previous arc, don't worry about it. Lee is sure he can melt right through her arm, but Alita doesn't say a word. She releases an electric charge that doesn't seem to do anything, then breaks contact. Lee is confused and laughs at her, before a lightning bolt descends from the sky and blows him up, leaving a very charred cyborg skeleton. I guess she charged his body such that he acted like a lightning rod. Alita pays him no more mind, as Yugo is starting to go cold. He's still alive, but only just, and not for long. She panics and dramatically screams no into the sky, but then Alita thinks of one way she can save him. Sometime later, Alita is leaping through the city, carrying Yugo's ruined body over her shoulder. She's taking him to Vector's place, though I'm not sure what good that would do at this point. Suddenly, a spotlight lights her up. It's Zapan, along with a small army of hunter-warriors and a netman. Remember when I said they arm up and take the lead to hunt Class A criminals? Well, the arm is an anti-hunter-warrior missile launcher, and Alita stands accused of hunter-warrior treason for refusing to kill a target, courtesy of Zapan. He wants to make sure Alita is either forced to kill the boy she loves, or dies protecting him. The netman's threats aren't the only incentive he brought. Dr. Ito is clinging to some antenna jutting off a building for dear life. Zapan demands that she carry out her job as a hunter-warrior and cut off Yugo's head. Zapan is eager to see Alita dead or in despair, but instead she simply reveals a package she was holding. Removing the wrappings, it's revealed to be Yugo's severed head. Zapan and Ito are stunned. The netman just says, "Duty complete. If Alita did kill the bounty, then there's no crime here." The hunter-warriors start to pack up and leave, grumbling at the anticlimax of it all. Zapan isn't done, though. He jumps down beside Alita and demands to know how she could so casually kill Yugo, the boy she loved, and act like everything was normal. He makes a grab for her, throwing Yugo's headless body away and threatening to crush the head. Not all is as it appears, however. Zapan sees that Yugo's head is tied into Alita's own circulatory system. His head and brain are still alive. This isn't as outlandish an idea as you might think. There have been disturbing experiments keeping severed animal heads alive temporarily, going back more than 100 years at this point. Anyway, Zapan's vindication is short-lived, however, as the Netman interprets his actions as an attempt to steal Alita's bounty. That means Alita is entirely justified to defend herself under factory law. One strike punches right through Zapan's head and blows off his face. At the chapter break, we move forward in time a bit. Vector is reading about what just happened in the newspaper. Apparently, the Scrapyard has newspapers written in what looks like Hebrew of all things. Is the plot twist that everyone in the Scrapyard is Jewish? It's an irrelevant detail, but now I feel like I need to ask. Anyway, as far as Vector and the public knows, Yugo is dead and his head is to be buried instead of being exchanged for chips. Zapan's face was destroyed, and we get a pretty gnarly look at his exposed brain right before he falls between the buildings. At Dr. Ito's clinic, we see what's actually happened as he just finished transplanting Yugo's head onto a cyborg body. He's almost as much a machine as Alita is now, and he'll have to live under a new identity. Ito commends Alita for her quick thinking in saving Yugo's life, but reveals that Yugo's first mistake was believing he could get to Zalem. He was being taken advantage of. There's no way to get to Zalem just by paying your way there. Ito knows this because he's from Zalem. The symbol on his forehead is the symbol of Zalem citizenship. Just then, Yugo bursts in, having been eavesdropping on this conversation, and accuses Ito of lying. He soon collapses, however, as he pulls away from the external power supply feeding his body. Apparently, Ito switches all his patients over to external power for precisely this reason. Ultimately, Alita realizes that they need to go to Vector to uncover the truth, though she doesn't seem to know what they'll do if it turns out Vector was lying. They do just that, Alita and Yugo forcing their way into Vector's office, Yugo having borrowed some threads from Ito. Yugo lays out his 10 million chips and demands Vector send him to Zalem. Vector tries to talk him out of it again, reminding him of the lucrative position he's offered, but Yugo is content to be a beggar in Zalem. Exasperated, Vector says fine, but he can only send people to Zalem one way. He rips a sheet off a group of containers with various body parts floating inside. Apparently, Zalem demands a single person's worth of organs and body parts each month. Vector has no idea what they do with the things. Yugo accuses Vector of planning to chop him up after taking his money, though Vector clarifies that he just thought Yugo would give up if he quoted an extravagant price. Until recently, he didn't think Yugo would ever show up with the money. Also, Vector himself has never been to Zalem. That was a rumor he started to bolster his reputation. All of that still means he tricked Yugo, who advances on Vector. The crime boss panics and calls for his bodyguard, Zariki. This massive combat cyborg might look familiar to you if you watched my previous video. He briefly appeared as Kanuba's opponent in the Colosseum in the previous arc. With Kanuba gone, he's the champion now, and Vector is his financial sponsor, so Zariki moonlights as his bodyguard, I guess. Alita is not perturbed. She just tells Yugo to keep talking to Vector. She's got this. In a brief fight, Alita effortlessly dodges her opponent and then pins his arm just by stepping on it. No wonder Yugo struggled to pull her up at the start of this arc. She really is heavy. Alita ends the fight by performing a somersault kick that caves in Zariki's skull. Yugo grabs Vector by the throat and pins him up against a wall, shaking with intense emotions. The final chapter of this arc opens on this scene, with Alita standing victorious as Yugo comes to terms with the fact that everything he's worked for has been built on a lie. After that moment of tension, though, Yugo lets Vector drop and starts laughing. He's shaking with an unhinged mirth, such that Alita starts looking at him with concern. Yugo is dead, he says. All of these chips are all that's left of him and his soul. He was such a fool that he never realized that all of these chips would have no value in Zalem. At this point, both Alita and Vector are looking at him like he's losing his mind. Alita interjects, telling Yugo that this isn't the end. He can have a new tomorrow with her even if he can't go to Zalem. Yugo is not receptive. He says that tomorrow means nothing to a dead man, and flees out the window. Alita gives Vector a death glare and follows after. Vector is just stunned that he got out of this situation alive. The rain has started up again as Alita loses Yugo in the crowd. The crowd starts to get riled up, however, as another sort of rain starts to fall. Chips. As the crowd fights over the money, Alita looks up to one of the transport tubes connecting Zalem to the ground. Yugo is walking along it, laughing hysterically but determined to reach Zalem. You might wonder why he's never tried something like this before. Well, there's a reason that Yugo encounters right now, a spinning ring of blades falling down the tube. Yugo's new cyborg body is serving him well, however. As we discover at the bottom, he's already dodged 6 rings, which is a record. A deckman tells Alita that these rat-catcher defense rings are set every 500 meters to catch anyone that tries to climb the tubes to Zalem. Whether it's allowed or not, Alita is going after him. It turns out Yugo didn't get past that last ring unscathed, however. He's lost his feet and is clinging to the tube with his hands. Just then, the clouds clear, and Yugo sees his goal. He addresses Zalem gleefully, almost worshipfully, as a deity that stands so far above everything else, calling himself a fool for letting himself get driven mad by it and losing everything. He's shocked out of his rant by Alita, who attempts to get him to come down. Yugo refuses to return to the Scrapyard, the place he hates and wants to get away from. He mentioned this before. His obsession with Zalem is more about escaping the Scrapyard than anything else. Furthermore, he just doesn't care anymore. He's decided that his existence was an unnecessary mistake, to which Alita calls him a coward. Zalem and the Scrapyard aren't everything. She only needs him, and they can find his way in life together. This finally seems to get through to Yugo, who agrees to come down with her. Alita has a moment of joy that she has won. She pulled Yugo away from his self-destructive obsession with Zalem. That is, just before they both hear the defense ring falling towards them, and Yugo is torn to pieces. Alita leaps above the spinning blades and catches what's left of Yugo by the arm, both of them dangling from the tube above with the clouds below. Yugo's arm is coming apart, however. He looks at her and says that he's glad he got to talk to her at the very end. Yugo says goodbye as his arm breaks and he falls. Alita is devastated, holding Yugo's arm and shaking. And that's the closing image of the Hunter-Warrior arc. Alright, thoughts on this arc. This arc doesn't have as much action as you might want coming off the conclusion of the previous arc. What fights exist still look great, but they're very short and one-sided. Alita is never really faced with a physical challenge she can't overcome with ease. What I like about this arc is that it takes that strength and turns it into a point of anxiety for Alita because of how easy it is for her to hurt people. She's also confronted with problems that she can't fight her way out of. The focus on Alita's feelings and emotions, while not absent from the first arc, is better highlighted here. She is compassionate and protective, yes, but also emotionally immature at this point, as she isn't sure what to do with her feelings for Yugo. And we will see more of her struggle with that after Yugo was so brutally torn away. As for Yugo, I said it already, but I don't really think of his relationship with Alita as much of a love story. Or if it is, it's an extremely immature romance. These are two young people that really don't have a grasp on their own emotions. It isn't hard to see what Alita sees in Yugo, though. Like Alita, Yugo is someone that chooses to walk his own path despite the environment of the Scrapyard. He had a goal and a dream of what he wanted from life, which Alita admired as she doesn't really have that herself. That just makes it all the more tragic that Yugo's dream led him to do some heinous things, even if he stopped short of killing anyone. And then it all turned out to be built on a lie. The fallout of all that ultimately led to his death. In a way, what happened to Yugo is a challenge to Alita's worldview described in the last arc, that people can choose their own destiny. Yugo has chosen his own path despite the world he lives in, but it ultimately only leads to tragedy for him. Alita's kindred spirit in Yugo is brutalized and killed, underscoring just how cruel and unrelenting this world can be to those who try to walk their own path. For Alita, this is a bit of a loss of innocence moment, kicking off a series of changes in her life and her priorities. We'll have to wait for the next video to cover that, however. For now, let me know what you thought of Yugo and Alita's story in the comments. Have a nice day.